The room was packed. A Georgetown legal symposium titled Global Governance and National Sovereignty had somehow become the most anticipated political event of the month. Diplomats, law professors, and policy advisors crowded the hall, but all eyes were on one table. On one side sat Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, sharp suit, sharper tongue. On the other sat Ibrahim Traoré, military officer, transitional president of Burkina Faso, and the man whose rise had disrupted the geopolitical comfort of half the Western world. Their session was supposed to be civil. It lasted 90 seconds before the tension cracked. Pam Bondi leaned forward, microphone turned up, voice honeyed but loaded. President Traoré, I understand your passion. But with respect, sovereignty without structure is chaos. And chaos doesn't feed people, it just empowers the ignorant. Gasps. Laughter. Murmurs. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He calmly removed the translation earpiece, set it down, and responded, not with fire, but with ice. In my country, we do not confuse arrogance for intellect. And we do not weaponize law to protect power from the people. Bondi smiled tightly, clearly waiting for applause. But the audience had shifted. They weren't looking at her anymore. All eyes were on Traoré. You speak of law, he continued, as if it is something granted. Where I come from, law was something denied. Denied by colonizers. Denied by courts. And yet, we still remember it. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Perhaps the problem isn't that I don't know the law. It's that I remember the one you forgot. Silence. Then one slow clap from a law student in the back. Then another. Then the room erupted. Bondi sat back, face still smiling, but her jaw was tight. And Traoré? He didn't celebrate. He simply folded his hands and waited. Because this wasn't about winning a moment. It was about exposing the truth beneath the podiums. Pam Bondi left the stage smiling for the cameras, but inside, something churned. Traoré had done what no one expected. He hadn't defended himself. He had exposed the foundation of her argument, and made it look like a cracked courtroom floor. Backstage, a Fox News producer pulled her aside. Do you want to go on Hannity tonight? You could own the story. Pam hesitated. No. Not yet. Let him talk more. The more he says, the easier it is to make him the radical. But what she didn't know, was that Traoré wasn't planning to talk more. He was planning to act. The very next morning, he released a 12-page open letter titled The Law We Remember, published in the New York Times, Le Monde, and Al Jazeera at the same time. It wasn't fiery. It was forensic. Page by page, Traoré outlined how Western-backed legal systems had invalidated land claims in Burkina Faso, imprisoned farmers under imported laws, and protected corporations over citizens. But the most damning part? A single clause from a 2009 American legal advisory contract, one that Bondi herself had co-signed while serving on a global legal task force. The clause read: Host country may not modify extractive agreements without consultation or liability to U.S.-based stakeholders. In plain English, Burkina Faso couldn't legally revise its own gold contracts, without risking a lawsuit in Washington. And Bondi had helped sign off on it. Now, the internet had receipts. Screenshots of her signature. Traoré's annotated commentary. A trending hashtag exploded. Hashtag the law she forgot. CNN picked it up. Then The Intercept. Then TikTok. Pam's team scrambled. But by the time they reached the press, the story had shifted. It was no longer about whether Traoré was qualified to speak on law. It was about whether Bondi had ever applied it fairly. The scheduled CNN debate was meant to be a balanced discussion on global legal fairness. It turned into something else entirely. Pam Bondi arrived first, poised, confident, dressed in crisp ivory. Her talking points were ready. Traoré was manipulating history, anti-capitalist, and performing for cameras. But when Traoré stepped onto the stage, holding a single yellow folder, the atmosphere shifted. Host Jake Tapper welcomed both, gave Pam the floor first. She wasted no time. This isn't about gold or contracts. It's about a man trying to shame the West into silence while ignoring his own legal system's instability. Then she turned to him directly. Tell us, Mr. Traoré, what court in Burkina Faso ruled that your revolution was legal? Traoré looked up slowly, then opened the yellow folder. No court did, he said. Because your contracts made it illegal to oppose you. He held up a photocopy of an internal memo from a US-based legal consultancy. This document, drafted by your team, refers to my country as a risk environment and outlines how to suppress civil dissent through policy pressure. Pam stiffened. You're quoting out of context, she said. Then let's read more, Traoré replied. He flipped pages. Read line by line. Phrases like, contain rural mobilization, expedite external arbitration, neutralize local judiciary leverage. Each sentence echoed louder than the one before. The audience was no longer blinking. Jake Tapper didn't interrupt. Pam tried to smile, but it cracked at the edges. This isn't a deposition, she muttered. No, Traoré answered. Because if it were, I'd be asking under oath. That line went viral before the commercial break. By the time they returned, hashtags had multiplied. Hashtag deposition debate. Hashtag under oath Pam. Hashtag Traor. And for the first time in a long career, Pam Bondi didn't finish her closing statement. Because in that moment, she wasn't the prosecutor anymore. She was the one on the stand. 3 days after the CNN segment, something unexpected landed on the desk of a mid-level court clerk in Tallahassee, Florida. It was a petition from a group of international law students, arguing that Pam Bondi had potentially violated ethics rules by signing legal language that undermined foreign sovereignty while holding public office. The complaint wasn't official. But it didn't need to be. It was loud. It caught the attention of multiple newspapers in Florida, then the Washington Post, then international media. The focus had shifted. What started as a televised argument was turning into an accountability campaign. Traoré didn't comment publicly. He didn't need to. Instead, his office published something simple, a scanned page from a colonial-era Burkina Faso land registry, where entire villages were labeled undesignated economic zones by French legal officers. And at the bottom of the image, one bold line added in Traoré's handwriting. We were never lawless. We were just overruled. That quote hit harder than any lawsuit. Pam's legal team held a private meeting. One advisor suggested launching a counteroffensive, demanding Traoré retract libelous suggestions. But her media strategist shook his head. The more we fight him, he said, the more we confirm his point. Meanwhile, students in D.C., Dakar, and São Paulo were holding forums titled The Law We Forgot, inviting legal scholars to dissect Western dominance over global legal architecture. Traoré's name was on every flyer. Pam's? Not even mentioned. That's when she realized something chilling. She wasn't just losing the argument. She was becoming the lesson. A month later, Pam Bondi was invited to speak at a closed-door roundtable hosted by a major think tank in D.C., the kind of space where former officials casually shape narratives and massage reputations. The theme was supposed to be rebuilding trust in global legal norms. But from the moment Pam entered the room, she could feel it. The tone had shifted. The nods were colder. The handshakes shorter. Someone had printed out Traoré's open letter and placed it at every seat. She scanned the room. Law professors. Former diplomats. A few journalists off record. And one person sitting quietly at the end of the table, Amadou Diallo, a West African trade lawyer, and one of Traoré's former legal advisors. Pam opened her remarks carefully. We must remember that structure, not sentiment, is the backbone of law. She smiled, hoping to steady the room. But Diallo leaned forward. Ms. Bondi, he said calmly, what you call structure, we remember as submission. A few heads nodded. Pam tried to regain ground. No one's questioning your experience, Mr. Diallo. No, he interrupted. But we are questioning yours. Silence. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a contract drafted by a US-backed firm, and read aloud. All disputes arising between resource companies and host nations shall be settled in international arbitration courts based outside of host legal jurisdiction. He looked up. That's what you signed off on. Pam froze. Not because she didn't recognize the document, but because she did. It had been buried in appendices, buried under technicalities. And now it was being read aloud like a verdict. Someone from the State Department cleared their throat. Let's not make this personal. But the room had already shifted. The tone wasn't personal. It was structural. And Pam Bondi had become the blueprint for everything they were trying to dismantle. She looked down at her notes. They no longer sounded like law. They sounded like excuses. Pam Bondi didn't respond immediately. She disappeared from panels for a few weeks. Cancelled a scheduled appearance at Columbia Law. Declined interviews, even friendly ones. But the internet didn't stop. Clips of her confrontation with Traoré kept circulating, now used in university lectures, activist reels, even memes. A side-by-side video went viral. On the left, Pam Bondi at the CNN debate, accusing Traoré of ignorance. On the right, Traoré calmly reading legal text she once signed, and letting the silence speak louder than the accusation. Caption. One spoke. One knew. Even conservative legal blogs, normally loyal to Bondi, began to peel away. One wrote. The law isn't about control, it's about credibility. And she lost both. Meanwhile, Traoré made no personal attacks. Instead, he launched a digital archive called Forgotten Clauses, a searchable database of legal agreements that restricted national sovereignty across the global south. It was transparent, unapologetic, and devastatingly effective. Pam's PR team tried to get ahead of the narrative. They released a statement. While we respect President Traoré's perspective, the complexities of international law shouldn't be reduced to social media snapshots. But that only made it worse. Because now, people were asking. Why did she need complexity to explain what he made clear in a sentence? At a conference in Berlin, a young law student asked a Western professor. Is international law still law if it only protects the powerful? That question, too, spread. And in private rooms across D.C., donors and advisors started whispering something Pam hadn't heard in a long time. She's a liability now. Pam wasn't just losing arguments. She was losing narrative space. The one arena where her authority had always lived. And in its place? Traoré's voice. Quiet. Measured. And impossible to dismiss. One evening in Ouagadougou, under soft lantern light, Traoré met with his legal team, not to gloat, but to act. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a legal clause from a 2009 agreement, a clause Pam Bondi had once defended. But now, Traoré's team had found its weakness. This clause, he said, was written assuming we would never understand it. But they forgot something. We've lived its consequences longer than they've studied its language. With quiet clarity, his administration announced a bold legal step. Burkina Faso would file a motion in the International Court of Justice to challenge the enforceability of historical legal agreements that undermined a nation's right to renegotiate extractive contracts. A move unheard of in modern legal circles. Pam's name wasn't in the filing, but her signature was. Within hours, global headlines exploded. Traoré targets old colonial clauses. Burkina Faso versus global arbitration. The Pam Bondi signature that came back. Back in the US, Bondi's former colleagues began distancing themselves. A former law partner told Politico. She didn't write the clause. But she didn't challenge it either. By morning, reporters stood outside her home, asking whether she would comment on the filing. She stayed inside. Because Pam Bondi was realizing something that couldn't be reversed. The clause she once thought buried, was now history's Exhibit A. And Traoré wasn't just teaching a lesson. He was rewriting the textbook. And for the first time in decades, a former colonial contract was on trial. At the African Legal Renaissance Conference in Addis Ababa, hundreds of legal minds gathered, judges, scholars, ministers. It was the most prestigious event of the year. Traoré was not supposed to attend. But on the final day, without announcement, he arrived quietly. The keynote speaker, a renowned constitutional scholar from South Africa, saw him enter and paused mid-sentence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we have among us someone who did not just speak of justice, but put it on paper." The room erupted. A standing ovation, not for words, but for the man who had challenged legal silence with legal substance. Traoré didn't take the podium. Instead, he sat in the back, notebook in hand, as students and jurists presented case after case citing his filing as precedent for sovereign review. A Nigerian law professor said. They called him unqualified. Now his strategy is being taught in law schools they never let him enter. In that moment, a shift was crystallizing. No longer was Traoré the outsider who disrupted the room. He was the reference point, the standard by which old frameworks were being re-evaluated. Meanwhile, in Florida, Pam Bondi received a formal notice. The Ethics Board would open a preliminary inquiry into her conduct during her time on the Global Legal Task Force. It wasn't a criminal charge. But it was the first time her name appeared on the other side of the legal table. No media outlet covered her reaction. No applause followed her statement. Because sometimes, the most powerful sound is the one you don't hear, when the world has moved on without needing your permission. And Pam? She wasn't just losing relevance. She had become a footnote in someone else's rise. 6 months later, a televised panel on international reform was aired on PBS. The panel included 2 legal scholars, a human rights advocate, and surprisingly, Pam Bondi. She looked composed, even measured. But something had changed. Gone was the rhetorical fire. In its place, hesitation. When the moderator asked about Traoré's legal challenge at The Hague, she replied, "I still believe in order and precedent. But I've come to realize, precedent isn't always justice." It was the first public concession she had ever made. But it was already too late. Because while she spoke from a U.S. studio, in The Hague, an interim ruling had just been issued. Historical arbitration clauses that deny post-colonial nations the ability to renegotiate resource contracts are not immune from sovereign legal review. The room erupted in applause. Not in the courtroom. In classrooms. In law schools. In rural community halls across Africa. It wasn't a full victory yet, but it was validation. And it had started with a single televised moment. A word, ignorant. And a reply, you forgot the law. Pam Bondi had tried to discredit a man by questioning his education. Instead, she had taught the world a lesson. That intellect without humility is a closed book. And power without justice is a hollow gavel. Traoré never gloated. He released a one-line statement. The law is only law if the people believe in it. That sentence became etched on murals in Ouagadougou, printed on shirts in Nairobi, quoted in graduation speeches at Harvard and Lagos. And Pam? She no longer appeared on legal panels. Because in the public eye, her story was no longer one of legal clarity. It was a case study in forgetting who the law is supposed to serve. It was dusk in Ouagadougou. Traoré stood quietly before a crowd, not at a rally, but in the courtyard of a rural courthouse his administration had just reopened. No red carpet. No media frenzy. Just villagers, farmers, and local judges. The only symbol on the wall was a weathered wooden carving of justice, a pair of open hands holding a balance. He took the microphone only once. No speech. Just a reminder. This ground belongs to the people. So must the law. Thousands of miles away, in Florida, Pam Bondi sat at her desk, her name removed from 4 legal advisory boards and 3 international panels. She wasn't disgraced. But she was, undeniably, irrelevant. Her final attempt at commentary, an op-ed titled, "The Danger of Populist Legalism," drew more ridicule than response. Because the world had already answered. They had seen what justice looked like when it came not from podiums, but from memory, when the law returned to those it was once used against. In academic circles, a term began to circulate, Traorian reform. It didn't mean revolution. It meant review, reclamation, and rewriting, with truth at the center. In a quiet moment back home, Traoré was handed a copy of his original CNN debate transcript with Pam Bondi. He smiled. Not because of what he had said, but because of what followed. 1 insult. 1 sentence. 1 forgotten clause. That's all it took to turn an accusation into a movement. And a courtroom into a classroom. He closed the folder. And walked into a meeting, not with diplomats, but with village elders. Because his work wasn't about proving the West wrong. It was about making sure his people were never unheard again. Pam Bondi tried to lecture him on law. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't argue. He revealed. He reminded the world that justice isn't written in contracts drafted oceans away. It lives in the silence of villages that never stopped remembering. She called him ignorant. He brought the receipts. And in doing so, he flipped the courtroom. Not by raising his voice. But by raising a question the world could no longer ignore. Who does the law really serve?